So 5G4D has been going for nearly 5 years now, and I'm sure many of you will have missed some of the early interviews because you weren't there at the beginning. I mean, why would you have been? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release some classic episodes from some legends of the industry that you might have missed. And so I hope you enjoy these shows, and I hope you enjoy the brand new ones that come out every 2 weeks. So thank you for listening, and enjoy. Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is a true legend of gaming, not just in Britain but worldwide. He's brought so much to the world of gaming through his company Games Workshop. He introduced the world to the Warhammer universe. He invented the wildly successful fighting fantasy books. And through his later career at Eidos, he introduced the world to Lara Croft. He holds 4 honorary doctorates, is on the board of many charitable foundations, and has won a BAFTA. My guest this week is Iam Livingstone. Ian, welcome to the cabin.
Hello. Great to be here.
So I want to start at the beginning. So you were born in Cheshire just 4 years after the war ended. How was your childhood there, and was there still a sense of the war hanging over the area at that time?
Well, I was born in Prestbury in Cheshire, but that was really a false picture of where I was actually living. We were living in Manchester. My father had met my mother during the war, in fact. He was on the D-Day landings and pushed on into Belgium and met my mother there. They got married right at the end of the war. She's from Belgium, from Antwerp, and they came back on a troopship carrier to a tiny Coronation Street type terraced house in Rusholme, quite near Manchester City's football ground. That's hence I became a lifelong Manchester City fan, as I used to go with my father. So it was quite tough. I came from a very humble background. I remember we didn't have very much at all, and therefore life in kind of that part of Manchester wasn't particularly luxurious in any way. Then we moved further afield, and ironically, I ended up in Cheshire, where I went to school at Altrincham Grammar School in the 1960s before finally moving down to London.
So I have these pictures of Manchester at that time with, as you say, the Coronation Street terraced houses and sort of rubble everywhere and stuff like that. Was it like that at that time? And was living in the industrial heartland of Britain a fun upbringing, or was it rough?
I think when you're a child, everything is fun. It's what is the normal of the time. I mean, looking back at the photos, it doesn't look particularly appealing, but when you're a child, you don't know anything different. That is as it is, and so I was a happy child, like most children, just enjoying it for what was available at that time. That just seemed the norm, so it was perfectly fine. I had a happy childhood.
And as you said, you attended the Altrincham Grammar School for Boys, and I was looking at the old boys list, and I was quite surprised that there's a couple of people from the Stone Roses attended the same school. What was grammar school education like at that time?
In the 60s, it was obviously a good education in terms of they were very much exam focused and wanting to get successful children attached to their school. But as a person attending there, I can't say it was a huge amount of fun. We had quite a few teachers who enjoyed punishing children as much as teaching them, because those were the days when corporal punishment was still allowed in schools. So there was quite a few vindictive teachers. I had one teacher who was a salvation, as it were. We always remember one teacher at school, but this particular guy called Roy Coleman really helped me navigate school because I was a bit of a nonconformist. I didn't like the being part of a sausage factory education system, and he treated everyone with respect and as individuals and gave us everybody nicknames and made it more of a enjoyable experience and treated us as human beings and equals. And so he kind of got me through that. But I didn't do well at school. I remember I just managed to scrape enough O levels, as it were, in those days, GCSEs these days, to get into sixth form, where I did three A levels and failed all but one, got the lowest grade. And before I went into the sixth form, I remember the head teacher saying, as you know, I was a bit of a rebel, I guess, saying, Livingstone, don't you think you'd be better off working in a garage or something rather than going to the sixth form? So they really knew how to inspire and encourage people back in those days.
I mean, so you weren't academically bent, but what was kind of your strength back then? What were you good at?
Thinking differently and playing games. I played enormous. I think one thing I enjoyed doing was playing chess for the school, and I also played enormous amounts of Monopoly. And it was at school that I acquired the nickname of Feed, because I used to play Monopoly with contempt for my fellow players. But if there was a small rent, if I owned Old Kent Road in Whitechapel, I just couldn't be bothered collecting the small amounts because I called it chicken feed, just to kind of annoy other people, really, just to wind them up. And then that's what they call it. Chicken feed got abbreviated to feed, and that name lasted with me until I left school. But so games playing and sports and not doing very well academically was what I remember from school.
And was it here that you met the Games Workshop co-founder Steve Jackson for the first time?
Yeah, there were three co-founders originally, and we all met at school. There was John Peake, Steve Jackson, and myself in different classes, but we shared a love of games and also Lambretta scooters, I recall, in the sixth form. And we used to play Subbuteo as well. And we all went our separate ways after school. Steve and John went to university. Steve did biology at Keele. John went to do civil engineering at Nottingham, but not having qualified for university, I went to Stockport College of Technology with my one rather poor A level and did business studies. So I did an HND in business studies and diploma in marketing, which actually stood me in great stead as a great help for establishing Games Workshop. But my true calling, I think, and what I was actually good at was creative thinking, and I liked imagining worlds and thinking of games and how to create games. I had a very rich imagination, so I think that non-conformity also allowed me to think creatively at quite an early age.
I mean, you were there in the 60s, so sort of the late 60s, early 70s. Did non-conformity sort of come easier? Because, my view of that time is, a time where everything was allowed to hang out. How true was that? And, were you in the middle of that sort of 60s, 70s foment?
Well, there was an awful lot going on. There was a rejection of a lot of the values that were held sacred by society at the time. And, you had the whole hippie period and rock music and blues, and there was quite a lot of anti-establishment feeling. I remember in the late 60s there were lots of marches, quite a lot of kicking against the norm, quite a lot of student voice, and I felt more aligned with not accepting the norm than accepting the norm.
So your first game then is a classic, and this is a choir. So when did you first play this, and did you play this when it first came out?
I think it came out 1964, something like that. I didn't play it in 64. I was only 14 then, so I played it probably some 10 years later, when we were actually able to get Avalon Hill games in the UK, because I'd heard about these Avalon Hill and SPI games, but wasn't able to get hold of any. But I finally got hold of a copy of Acquire and loved it. I mean, it was yeah. I'd been playing a lot of war games up until that point, tabletop battles and some hex gridded games, board uh, war games, but hadn't really played any decent strategical games. And along comes this game about corporate acquisition and mergers, and it seemed to have a very elegant tile placement system, and lots of things to think about. You wanted to have shares in the smallest hotel chains, and so they'd be acquired. You can make profit by being in the right hotel chain. And I just found it was very elegant, and it's not too deep, but lots to think about. I mean, that's kind of where I sit. I think you'll see in all the games I've chosen. Is particularly kind of gone back to my roots. I went through a period of playing very heavy games, and then realized at my age I can't deal with that anymore. So the group that we have tends to play these kind of lighter but still non-luck oriented games. So hopefully skill will prevail over luck, but not having to spend 2 or 3 hours getting to that point of victory. Later on in life, I did get to meet Sid Saxon in the States a couple of times, and he was an incredible guy. Visited his house in the Bronx because I'd become a fan of several of his games, and got to know him eventually and visited his house. And every room in his house was line to line, wall, ceiling to floor, shelving, crammed full of games. Everything apart from, I think, guess from the bathroom and the kitchen, but everywhere had games. The cellar racked out completely. I think he had something like 15,000 board games in there. And he was a prolific designer, and he's a legend of the time, and amazing guy. He'd been burgled a few times, but they never touched one game of his.
I mean, I always get, when I see a picture of Sid Saxon, it evokes this sort of image of a kind of mad professor, someone who sort of, his brain crackles constantly with sort of creativity and new ideas. What was he like as a man? Was he full of energy? Was he like that, or was he more a sort of calm, relaxed individual?
He was just, you were in his presence. He was very humble and hugely knowledgeable, obviously, about games. And he was just great to be around. And what he didn't know about games wasn't worth knowing. He could tell you about every game practically on the planet and what was good and bad about them. It was just fascinating to listen to him talk about games in general. Sadly, he ended up with Alzheimer's, and I visited him during that period, and it was a very sad time to see him not being the person he once was.
And so how important is Sid Saxon to the gaming landscape today, would you say?
Well, he has certainly changed things in many ways. We'd all, when I was young, the only games that were really available were family games. Clearly, you could play Monopoly and Cluedo and a whole host of luck-based games, from Snakes and Ladders to, the only game of any significance really was chess. And he helped change the landscape, whereby strategy and tactics were an important part of the game, not just relying on the roll of a die. So through his determination, and he was able to get companies to publish his games, which was a great step, and obviously laid the foundations for the games in the board games industry and market as we know it today.
So I want to go on now and talk about the formation of Games Workshop. What was the British gaming landscape like at that time when you were starting the company?
It was mainly American games. There was a couple of small British companies, but they didn't add up to much. All the excitement was coming from the United States, mainly in terms of Avalon Hill board games and SPI, Simulations Publications Inc., with their hex gridded board games, war games. And I was a player of those. How we got to do Workshop is that Steve, John, and I met up back in London after we'd been through our education programs, and we all had pretty ordinary jobs, pretty low paid, and didn't have enough money to be able to go out very often, so we stayed in and played board games. And we decided to think about how can we actually form a community? How can we reach out and find other people who are like ourselves? So we decided we'd publish a newsletter, which we called Owl and Weasel. And that the first edition came out in February 1975. It was basically a 4-page instant print fanzine, for want of a better expression. And we printed 200 copies. With my marketing training, I said, let's send out a free copy to everybody we knew in games, which we did. I'd also been given a mailing list from Don Turnbull, who was publishing a magazine, a fanzine called Albion, which I did some artwork for. It's a postal diplomacy game magazine. In fact, diplomacy was one of the true strategical games that was around at the time before the advent of the new wave of strategy games. And one of the recipients of Alan Weiss, although we hadn't sent it to him directly, was Gary Gygax, living in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. He wrote to us and said, love your magazine. Here's a copy of the game I've just invented. Would you like to review it? And that game, of course, was Dungeons and Dragons. And it didn't look like much, 3 largely unintelligible rule books in a very plain box. But when you open that box and played, it opened not just the box, it opened up your imagination that no game had previously done. I don't think any game ever will again. And here was a system whereby you could role play and become wizards and heroes and fighters and clerics and go on these fantastic journeys of the mind, exploring a dungeon that had been created by a separate dungeon master. And the kind of theatre on the fly, this interactive experience was like none other, and I'm incredibly obsessed about D&D, and we dedicated issue 6 of Owl and Weasel to D&D. So we ordered, having played it, we ordered 6 copies of D&D because that's all the money we had. And on the back of that order, we got a 3-year exclusive distribution agreement for the whole of Europe from Gary, because he was also operating out of a flat in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So we were all role-playing businessmen about a role-playing game. It was quite amusing, really. So we started selling it through Owl and Weasel as effectively a mail order, and people would occasionally be outside. We'd see them outside our flat in Shepherd's Bush, milling around on the street, and we were on the 3rd floor and opened the window because they were looking for a shop, because we called the company Games Workshop. And we used to say, you want workshop? Up here, mate. And the reason why we called it Games Workshop, because we'd started off by making wooden games. John was an expert carpenter, even though he was trained as a civil engineer, so he made classic wooden board games like backgammon, Mancala, and Go boards. I'd go and sell them to retail, and Steve would do the admin. But it was a very low revenue, hand to mouth, part-time side hobby of ours, in which we ran adjacent to our actual professions. But that was the birth of Workshop. It started in the top floor of a Shepherd's Bush flat.
And so, I've interviewed a lot of people for this show, and a lot of people have spoken about Games Workshop. People of a certain vintage, and they always talk about that original idea of Games Workshop, that it wasn't solely focused on its own products. It was a place that was sort of the hub for gaming in Britain. And they always talk about, there was a time at which Games Workshop stopped being the Games Workshop I got into it for. What was the original idea for Games Workshop in terms of that? Did you want to be the hub for gaming around Britain?
Well, we wanted to be part of a community, a games community, to find and interact with like-minded people who enjoyed playing the games that we did. So we started off by wooden games, and then we transitioned quickly to role-playing games, because we suddenly found our element, as it were. And so we sold an ever-increasing number of role-playing games. Steve and I went to the States in 1976 to attend Gen Con, and we signed up all the fledgling games companies we could possibly get our hands on. And we came back to the UK. At that time, John had left because he didn't like role-playing games particularly. He preferred classical games, and so we parted company. So we came back. We had nowhere to live. We'd left our flat in Shepherd's Bush. John got new flat sharers, and we had to find somewhere else to live. That was Steve and I. We went to the bank manager, see if we could get a loan because we needed somewhere to live and offices for workshop. And you go to the bank manager and say, "Hey, we've got this great game. It's a role-playing game. We're heroes and wizards and kill monsters and find treasure." And he kind of looked at you rather like a dog watches television, had no understanding whatsoever of what you're trying to do, and urged you out of his room quite quickly. So we ended up having to live in Steve's van for 3 months. Because we found a small office, again in Shepherd's Bush, the size of a bread bin, from which we ran our mail order business. And that's what we did. We sold American games, as many as we could get our hands on, first through mail order, and then people wanting more and more. So we finally opened our first retail store in Hammersmith in April 1978. And then that was a true generalist game store, not just Dungeons and Dragons, but Avalon Hill Games and Fantasy Games Unlimited and Judges Guild and a whole host of hobby and strategy games. And it did become a mecca. People traveled from far and wide to visit our first shop in Downing Road. And so we had very fond memories of that. But over time, the business changed, as businesses do. At the end of our 3-year period of exclusivity with Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax had written to us saying he'd like to merge the two companies, TSR, which was his company, and Games Workshop was Steve and mine. And we were independent young Brits at the time, and we turned that merger opportunity down. Of course, at that time, you realize that we'd kind of lost the lifeline, the exclusive lifeline to our business in giving up the exclusivity of Dungeons and Dragons. But although we remained the largest distributor, because we had all the retail contacts at the time, we were now vulnerable. And that's really how Warhammer came about, really. It was that we needed to replace that product, which was something owned by TSR, with a product that was owned by us, Games Workshop. And we'd already started Citadel Miniatures, working with Brian Ansell, the co-founder of Citadel, with us. And Brian was also keen to establish an intellectual property that belonged to the company. And he, with two of his designers, Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley, came up with the first Warhammer concept. And the company slowly transitioned to becoming kind of Warhammer-focused company, and also around White Dwarf and Citadel Miniatures. And over time, what was seen as effectively competing products were taken out of the stores. And that was not to everyone's satisfaction, but it was definitely the right business decision, as the company now has had experienced tremendous growth over the years. I mean, we're no longer involved with the company. We sold our remaining shareholding in 1991. But if you see what's happened to Workshop, it's now a publicly traded company on the London Stock Exchange. It's now got a value of over £3 billion. So clearly that was the right decision from a corporate point of view. The customers are clearly happy with it because they love the Games Workshop experience and playing Warhammer and buying figures, etc. And whilst it was a little bit sad that some of the other games were taken out of the store, it was done for the right reason. And if we'd stuck with that original business model, would Workshop still be there today? Not definitely.
And so when you look at Games Workshop today, as you said, it's traded on the London Stock Exchange, it's worth $3 billion. And Warhammer, especially Warhammer 40k, is this leviathan of gaming. How close is that to your original conception of the company? And, do you approve of the direction that they've taken?
We had no idea it could possibly get to this sort of size and scale. I mean, who would have? If you're living in a van in Shepherd's Bush on a winter's day in 1976, how would you think possibly it could be worth £3 billion all those years later? So I would say no idea that could possibly have happened. Do I approve? I approve of the fact that it's a great British success story born out of nothing. That's created intellectual property, given pleasure to millions of people around the world, given employment to thousands and thousands of people, and something to be celebrated. It wasn't an easy early ride. And in fact, I'm writing a book with Steve Jackson about the first 10 years of Games Workshop called The Dice Man, which is being published by Unbound, a crowdfunding publisher. And it's been quite amazing talking to the people who used to work for us all those years ago and getting photos and images that we're going to put into the books and kind of trying to tell that story, how it actually evolved and how it almost fell over and failed many times, but somehow we got through to eventually handing it on to Brian, who bought us out, and then him and us also being bought out by Tom Gerby, who then floated the company in 1994, and with public capital behind it, became a Leviathan, and a great British success story can be viewed in only those terms, I think.
So your next game then is one that you've talked quite extensively about already, and that's D&D. So I think of Gary Gygax as this sort of legend, especially as he's passed away, and I'll never get to meet him. So that legendary bubble will never be popped. But how was it to work with him? What was he like as a guy?
Well, he was an amazing raconteur. The stories he told and the way he told them was just enthralling. He was very funny. He was a larger-than-life character, and I think that was reflected in his writing of D&D. Clearly, he didn't do it on his own. He worked with Dave Arnson in the beginning, but he was a driving force. Without Gary, D&D, I don't think would have become what it did become ultimately. And he was just you could say a fun guy to be with. We had lots of laughs together, and we played games together, and we drank together, and we ate together many times, and it was always a hugely enjoyable experience. And I think you can see the way the imagination is so impacted by D&D. I mean, that's how you kind of differentiate board games and role-playing games from video games. Role-playing in particular stimulates the imagination, whereas video games tend to stimulate the senses. And so he was all about the story and the character, which was the compelling element of his role-playing game. And it's true. I remember him saying, I can't remember who he said it to, that he preferred radio to television because the pictures are better. He liked stuff that happens in your mind rather than on a screen in front of you.
And so, TSR, what Games Workshop is today, TSR was in the early to mid 80s. I read a book on D&D, and you've got Gary Gygax flying out to Hollywood to discuss TV shows and stuff. When that was happening, was there a sense among you that one of us was hitting the big time, and was there a sense of support and a sense of at last we've arrived?
Well, when we said no to the merger, it was quite a worrying decision. We didn't fancy spending half our lives in the States at that time, and we wanted to remain independent as a business. But we always felt we were kind of in the shadow of TSR at the time. We always felt we were the smaller of the two companies because clearly they owned Dungeons and Dragons and we didn't. We were their distributors, so we were not employees as such, but we were totally dependent on them for our existence in many ways. It wasn't until we'd established our own products and services, from White Dwarf and Citadel to ultimately Warhammer and a whole host of board games and accessories that were ultimately produced over time, did things change. And TSR, didn't realize its own potential, whereas Workshop did. TSR ended up in a bad place, and ultimately was bought by Wizards of the Coast, almost effectively under duress. It was a kind of a distressed asset in many ways, and Wizards picked up an incredibly valuable intellectual property, and then made the most of it, and in turn got bought out by Hasbro. But Workshop did it on their own. They through getting finance in and ultimately floating, they remained independent and ended up being many, many, many times larger and more successful than TSR. But at the time, we thought we were in the shadow of TSR.
Now, I know what you're thinking. What do I actually get if I join the 5 Games for Doomsday Patreon? Deploy Salesman Voice! An absolute ton of bonus content is the answer. You can get some of this.
A war of whispers.
Whispers, you say?
I'm doing a stage whisper. I'm not actually whispering.
What's the difference?
Well, because actually what I'm doing is actually talking, whereas you're whispering. That's the difference, because I'm a trained actor and you're like a techo.
Or this. Nostalgia infects. It's a pernicious virus that leaches into the ripples of the brain. It's a neurotoxin that affects behaviour. As the reality of life and death sinks in, nostalgia, previously dormant, starts to pull levers in the psyche. And maybe even a little bit of this.
Like smoking a fag or drinking a pint. Maybe having something to eat. Or a little bit of a shag. All things, Steve, must come to an end.
For as little as $5 a month, you can get Battle Reports, where me and the fragrant Steven Cyrek report on a game as it's being played. Thoughts from the cabin. You like pretentious? Then you'll love these. And I even sometimes go outside and ask the hard-hitting questions that never needed asking. To get all this and a feeling of smug superiority, just go to patreon.com/5G4D. Join the community and help me eat. That's patreon.com/5G4D. Because content never tasted so good. So good. God, I feel dirty. So I want to go on now and talk about another thing that you're hugely famous for, and this is the Fighting Fantasy series. So when I was writing the notes for this, I was doing a bit of research, and it was interesting that you were embroiled in the satanic panic of the 80s, and one woman claimed her child started to fly after reading one of your books. What do you remember of that time and that sort of craziness that was engendered during the satanic panic?
Well, Fighting Fantasy came about as a result of Workshop. We used to hold Games Days, and if Games Day 79, we used to have other companies take trade stands there, one of which being Penguin Books. And the very far-sighted editor who attended on behalf of Penguin was Geraldine Cook. And she was fascinated by the number of people playing D&D in particular at Games Day, and asked Steve and I whether or not we'd be prepared to write a book about the hobby of role-playing. And we said rather flippantly, well, rather than write a book about the hobby, why don't we write a book that allows you to experience a role-playing game? And she said, no, that sounds like a great idea. And we hadn't really thought how we were going to do it. But we ended up working on what we called provisionally the Magic Quest, which was a branching narrative taking the essence of role-playing games, replacing the Dungeon Master with a in book format. And so creating a branching narrative, but with a game system attached to it to add a bit more meaning to and consequence as a result of the choices that you had to make. And so we worked on this idea, sent through a synopsis, and she then took it to her managing director, who apparently laughed so hard, banged his head on the desk. So it took over a year for them to actually get their heads around the idea that an interactive book could possibly work when, of course, historically, it was only straight linear books that had ever been successful in publishing. But to her credit, she fought our corner and got the concept approved. But it wasn't until August 1982 that The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which the Magic Quest ultimately became known as, was published. And it didn't have much belief really and support from Penguin, because they didn't really understand what an interactive book was. And so we promoted through White Dwarf magazine, but it really took off after we'd appeared on Radio 1. When reading out choices on air, and people would phone in and make those choices, and it got a whole lot of furore about it. And so it started to sell out in pockets around the country in schools, and then the playground chat, which was the virality of the day, accelerated with the awareness of Fighting Fantasy and Warlock. And so Penguin still didn't have great belief, so they reprinted like 10 times in the first month, small numbers, until Geraldine came on the phone elated, saying, "We need 2 more." So Steve then wrote Citadel of Chaos, and I wrote Forest of Doom. And so they were selling huge quantities, and because they were interactive, it was empowering readers who were used to straight linear text, which they read passively, maybe or maybe not relating to the story they were reading. But suddenly they were empowered through choice, and it was their adventure. And they were making all decisions. So giving a reader agency was suddenly fun. So that was the game. That's why we call them Final Fantasy game books, because you played and read through the books. But of course, because they were all mostly focused around dungeons and monsters and finding treasure, and there would be ghouls and demons, that's kind of triggered the kind of satanic panic that was going on at that time in the early 80s. And the Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide about them, saying, because you're interacting with ghouls and demons, you're going to get possessed by the devil. The lady you referred to appeared on Deepest Suburbia local radio, saying, having read one of the books, her son levitated. The local vicar at Penguin Books, near Penguin Books, threatened to chain himself to their railings until they were banned. There were articles written about them saying the dangers of children using their imaginations too much. They were burnt in some areas, in countries. They were letters petitions sent in to Penguin from worried parents, saying that their children are spending far too much time playing and reading through Final Fantasy game books. At the same time, teachers were actually saying, hey, these are actually quite good. They're actually improving literacy quite significantly. Hey, they're great for reluctant readers. Hey, they're great for problem solving. Hey, they're great for critical thinking. Hey, they're great for encouraging creative writing. Hey, they're great for encouraging art. And suddenly the beneficial part of Final Fantasy became discovered. So there was this kind of clash between those who thought they were a danger and those who thought they were the best thing ever for children, who were normally bored by reading a traditional book. But we, of course, never were got the plaudits really at the time, because of there was no social media and appearing. We had number 1, 2, and 3 in the bestsellers list most of the time, and yet no one really talked about it. I did go on Saturday Superstar once and talk through the top 10 books, and I remember John Craven, who was interviewing me, said his question was when I was going to write a proper book, and to which I cannot believe you said that. I said, children are reading these books. Isn't it just important and good that they're reading? Anyway, they've sold 20 million copies around the world. Something must be right.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, they've sold an incredible amount of copies. Did the Fighting Fantasy books make you personally financially independent?
Well, I don't really want to go into my financial background.
I don't want you to give me figures or anything.
Yeah, I mean, Workshop and Fighting Fantasy and IDOS and some of the independent game studios has made me financially independent. But the most important thing for me, I never did any of this for money. Money has been a very welcome byproduct. But when you're living in a van, you're not doing it for money. We were driven by a passion for wanting to be in the games industry and being creative and create content that we wanted to play and we wanted other people to play. It's nice to have been rewarded for our success, but that was never the motivating factor originally.
So your next game then is another classic, and this is Carcassonne. And when I play this game, the word I would use to adequately describe it is pleasant. Does this game just make you feel good when you play it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it also gets frustrating because I never know what the best move is, and that's why I want to keep playing it. I mean, I think I like tile placement games. I just like collecting. I'm a collector at heart. I've got 1,000 board games in the room I'm sitting in now. Used to collect other things before, as well as I always collected games. I once had the largest collection of Guinness advertising memorabilia in the world. So I am a collector. So therefore, tile placement and card collecting really kind of strikes a chord with me. But the thing about Carcassonne is it's nice to see that the maps evolve and the simple choices, the consequences of our actions. There's even alliances to be had and made, and we enjoy playing it face to face, and we also enjoy playing it online. During the pandemic, I run a games night club, which I've been doing since the 1980s, in which Steve Jackson, a member, and Peter Molyneux, and a couple of others from the games industry. And it works well digitally as well as in physical format.
And you're famous for what is termed in the industry sort of American style games or miniature war games. But how much of a fan are you of the sort of classic Euro game?
Oh, I love Euro games. I think that's the sweet spot for me. I was brought up on diplomacy and Avalon Hill games and SPI games and kind of heavy war gaming and then deep strategy games. But whilst I always saw them a little bit more like work, I think the Euro games are more like fun. And I like enjoying myself when I'm playing games. So I like games that have lots of like-minded people, social interaction, ability to stab each other, creating lots of entertainment and the theatre on the fly that I mentioned that I used to have with playing Dungeons and Dragons. That enjoyment of conversation that's not pre-planned; it just happens as a result of the actions you take in the game. So I like kind of games that are a bit lighter, not ones where you're staring like a long game of chess, staring at the board, thinking, what is the optimum move to do here? And we're having to wait, half an hour for your next turn to come around. I like lots of player interaction and, of course, more strategy than luck. But I don't mind luck at all. Everyone loves rolling a dice, but it should never be a dominant factor or feature of any game in particular.
So I want to talk now about your transition from the analog side of things to the digital side of things. How did you get into digital gaming?
It was during Games Workshop. It was 1984, to be precise. Death Trap Dungeon. I'd written a few Final Fantasy games that's on my own by then. After Steve and I corrupted and Warlock Five Top Mountain, then I subsequently wrote Forest of Doom, City of Thieves, and then Death Trap Dungeon. And Death Trap was number 1 in the children's bestsellers charts. It was like number 8 in all books sold in Britain, including adults. And still running Games Workshop at the time, so it's a very tough time in terms of hours of the day, running Games Workshop during the day and going back to our now respective homes. We'd actually moved out the van by then, a long time ago, and writing Final Fantasy game books till the small hours, much to the annoyance of my girlfriend at the time, I recall. And anyway, this got a call from 2 guys who just started a small, and obviously small because it was a startup video games company called Domog. They were ex-advertising agency guys. They'd seen that my books were number 1 in the charts and knew about Games Workshop and said, would I be interested in designing their first video game? And yes, I said I would be interested because we'd already been selling Activision games in console games in Workshop. We'd also developed a few of our own games for Spectrum and the Commodore PET even. And so I was already interested in the medium, and I was seeing technology coming over the horizon in ever increasing speeds. So I thought I'd like to get an understanding of the creative process of making a digital game rather than an analog game, and realize that it's not very easy, and then it's something you can't do on your own, which you can with a book or you can with a board game. you needed teams of artists and programmers and a whole host of separate skills working as a team to create this digital entertainment product. So I said yes, and this game was called Eureka. It was different in that it had a £25,000 prize for the first person to solve the mystery, and it was programmed in Budapest and Hungary for secrecy, so no one could find out the answer too soon. So there were clues in the rule book and clues in the game itself. And I decided at that time in 1984 to actually invest in Domok and just park it there for when things changed. And in 91, when we sold out a workshop, they asked me to join the board of Domok, which I did. And I invested a bit more and joined the board. And 4 years later, we put 4 companies together, merged 4 companies to create Eidos Interactive, which we floated on the London Stock Exchange in 95. I became executive chairman. And of course, the biggest thing about Eidos is less than a year later, we'd acquired the studio that was developing Tomb Raider, and we launched Tomb Raider, starring the wonderful Lara Croft in October 1996. And that's really how Eidos took off at a huge velocity to become a very major UK publishing house of video games. So that's how I got on the video games ladder.
And so what is it like to be at the vanguard of such a sort of cultural phenomenon? Because I was a teenager when Tomb Raider first came out, and it seemed like the whole world became instantly obsessed with it. What was that like to be on the inside of?
That's amazing. I mean, we were very fortunate to acquire a studio. I mean, it was even though it's publicly traded, Eidos was still a relatively small company, and we were able to acquire the company. It was larger than us, Centergold, and with Centergold came Core Design, the developers of Tomb Raider. They were located in Derby. As part of what you call the due diligence period, where you're kind of looking at the assets of the company, the target company, that I went to visit Core Design and looked through all their games in development. All looked pretty good, but it wasn't until I got into the last room where you could really see, somewhat cornily, that it was love at first sight. Historically, at that time, most games were 2D or side-scrolling, and here's a game with a 3D character moving into a 3D world. So it's incredible technology and amazing graphics. And the level editor there allowing people to move through the game in ways that hadn't been done before. And of course, had a female character. So here's a game that had an amazing character, a female character at first, with amazing technology, amazing graphics, amazing gameplay. But we had no idea just how popular Tomb Raider would become. And so I think we had 100,000 units in the budget for the first one. I think over time we sold over 7 million copies of the very first Tomb Raider. But being part of that phenomenon was amazing. The amount of media attention Lara Croft got, gracing the covers of not just games magazines, but lifestyle magazines. She became a kind of cultural phenomenon. And then, licensing the film rights to Paramount, got to meet Angelina Jolie on the set, who was incredible. Clearly, she's, phenomenon in multiple ways. Hugely intelligent, athletic, perfect fit for Lara Croft. And the principles of the game still appeal today. The 3 pillars of exploration, puzzle solving, and combat. It was look back and say, wow, amazing. But at the time, you don't see it as amazing. We didn't see D&D, we didn't see Warhammer, we didn't see Fighting Fantasy in the early stages becoming the phenomenon that they actually became. Because when you're living in the moment, you just can't really appreciate the potential that is there to become what they ultimately became.
So your next game then is, again, another classic, but a sort of more of a modern classic this time, and this is Seven Wonders. Is this the sort of daddy of drafting games, do you think?
I think so, yeah. I think it's short as well. I mean, I'd say at our age, we like shorter games, in between an hour tops is where we like to be as our group. And you can play again physically, and again you can play on Board Game Arena. So that's what we tend to do. What we've been doing during the pandemic is that we play, the games on BoardGameArena.com, and we have a Zoom chat open so we can insult each other and do deals. So that's how we've been carrying on the Games Nightclub during the pandemic. In fact, we've been playing a lot more because we haven't had to meet up in each other's homes. So that's been great. But getting back to the game itself, again, it's card development and deck collecting, which speaks to me as a player. And there's loads of options, and then there's a bit of aggression there if you want to kind of go the getting the armies route, or not just develop your wonder without having to resort to battles. But there are multiple ways of playing, and ultimately loads of ways of winning. It always seems different. So yeah, it's a milestone again. I think I like it a lot.
And do you think that these games that offer an awful lot of depth, an awful lot of thought, and an awful lot of enjoyment in an hour is a modern phenomenon, or were there always great examples of that in gaming?
Well, I think most people, a lot of people, it depends where you are in your life, I think. I mean, a lot of people seem to prefer games that go on forever. You look at Board Game Geek, all the games that are rated like 8 and above always seem to have 120 minutes playing time, which for someone our age probably means 480 minutes of playing time. So some people like the grind. We've just, I think through age more than anything else, prefer things that aren't so heavy. We just like that kind of mid-core game.
So I want to talk now about the future. So you've written a book on board games, and you mentioned it earlier. You've got a book on the history of Games Workshop. How did they come about, and sort of what can we expect from those books?
Well, the board game book, it's Board Games in 100 Moves, was published last year by DK. It's a lavishly illustrated book about 100 games that I think have affected the world in some positive way or other, and features some of the games that I really enjoy playing myself. That's a hardback book, so it's already out there. You can get it on Amazon. And it's I think the price is reduced right now. And the book about Games Workshop was an idea I had. I ran it by Steve, who wants to be involved. He said yes, he would, and we had been talking to the publisher at Unbound, the crowdfunding publisher, and they said they'd be very interested in publishing such a book. So it's you make a pledge. It's still live now. If anybody wants to do it, there are various things you can get if you pledge. Not just the book, you can get signed copies of all the Fights Up Mountain that we're going to give away. There's various pledges depending on what kind of reward you want. But it's been fascinating, as I said, writing it and talking to some of the people we hadn't talked to for literally decades, and trying to. The hardest bit is trying to get the facts straight. Time does warp a lot of things, and one person's ideas of what happened is sometimes totally different to another's. No one's trying to create fake news, as it were. It's just time distorts true memory. But it's been great fun. So the plans are to have it. I'm told it should be out about this time next year, if not a little bit before. It's called Dice Men.
And so when you think about your life in games and your career in games, what do you think your impact has been?
Well, hopefully I've helped people have a fun time. I think life should be enjoyed. And I think games is brings people together in a very positive way. It's not escapism as such. It's just a great way to interact with people, to have a thing through which you interact and talk about other things as well as the games themselves. So I like to think I brought some entertainment, some fun, some amusement, some joy, some pleasures, and hopefully painted games in a positive sense. Games in video games, where I still am, there's always been a lot of negativity associated with games. About people talk about violence in games, about games being addictive. There's no evidence anywhere that suggests games are addictive. No scientific evidence, and people never talk about the good things about games. If you think about a game, and part of your prejudice against about one or two titles that are 18 rated and shouldn't be played by children anyway. 95% of games content is family friendly. But forgetting the 18 rated games, and just think cognitively what's happening when you're playing a game. Problem solving. You cannot get through a game without problem solving. You learn how to play intuitively through trial and error. You're encouraged to play again. There's no kind of failure. You're encouraged to play again. You can fail in what is effectively a safe environment. Whereas an examination at school is a kind of a binary decision. A, you get it right, you're able. B, you get it wrong, you're less able. And there's no comeback. And games inspire creativity. Games like Minecraft, where you're building these wonderful 3D architectural worlds and showing with your friends, learning by doing and learning things in context. A child will learn by applying the heat of a furnace to silica sand. They'll create glass and they'll contextually put that into their worlds, and they won't forget that because it's an application of knowledge which is often lacking in school learning. Games like Roller Coaster Tycoon, effectively a management simulation, learning about the physics of the rides, the economics of staffing the rides and the pricing. And if you build it right, the virtual customers will come. If you don't, it doesn't matter. You're not punished. You just tweak the parameters and you'll build a successful theme park. So over time, everyone can be a winner. So that to me is a good thing. Our Final Fantasy game books were ultimately deemed as being very positive because they were shown actually to raise literacy levels by 17%. And other things I was talking about, critical thinking and problem solving, all these can be played in a Final Fantasy game book. And therefore, it's learning in a much more enjoyable way. And I think there's no reason why learning shouldn't be enjoyable. So, you're problem solving and doing so much positive things for the kind of human condition, I would say, when playing games. And if I've contributed to that in any way, that makes me very happy.
So your final game then is Splendor. And this is quite a divisive game and people sort of call it overrated. And is this game more than just the chips?
Well, I think it's very elegant because you've got the choices are simple. Take the chips, buy the card, or reserve a card, and it doesn't seem like much. But there's quite a lot of depth to it. I think. Do you hang for the low-hanging fruit to buy the low scores and the resources cheaply, or do you suddenly shoot up to try and get the? You've got to get a lot of the timing right, and. Do you go for those valuable cards now, or do you wait a little bit more? There's quite a lot of things to think about, and so I enjoy it. It's a very light game, but it still has enough to think about that makes it enjoyable. I say the games we play a lot are these kind of lightish to mid-core games, and that happens to be one of them.
So I've got one final question then. So you're heading out to the cabin, driving down the road, 88 miles an hour, and you go around a corner and the back door flies open. 4 of the games fly out of the car, down a ravine, into a river and are swept away to posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
Yeah, well, I mean, people always often ask me what's my favourite game. And I think it's a bit like asking what's my favourite child, and I've got 4 of them. I think it's very impossible. It's almost impossible to say one absolute because you want to play with 2 people, 6 people. Do you want to play for an hour, half an hour, 3 hours? Do you want to play a serious game? Do you want to play a light-hearted game? What's the context? I mean, if I was on a desert island, I'd probably choose chess, none of which appear on the list. Because ultimately, chess you can always improve over time, and it is the purest game. Some might argue Go is a purest game, But if I'm not allowed to take chess, because that's probably the game you'd have to take, because you never, ever, ever, ever get bored with that, I don't think. Which one of those 5 would I take? I guess it would have to be D&D for the affection I have for it in my heart and the career path it ultimately gave.
Fantastic. So if people want to get hold of you, if they want to buy the book, how can they go about that?
Well, if they want to buy Games in 100 Moves, they can go to Amazon and get it there. It's published by DK. If they want to get Dice Man, The History of Games Workshop Early Years, they have to go to unbound.com, I believe, where they can still pledge to get it for when it's published next year. But, I'm not done with games. Games are my life. They're my passion. Work and play is the same. I'm still very much actively involved in the games industry. I'm on the board of, I think it's 8 video games companies now. Chairman of Sumo Group PLC, based at Sheffield, 1,000 developers and creators of video games. I still like to think I can add contribution to content. I like putting my finger in everybody else's pies these days. I'm actually designing a board game as part of my nighttime entertainment at the moment. Hopefully, maybe someone might be interested in publishing that. And I will write one more Fighting Fantasy game book for the 40th anniversary in 2022. So for me, life is a game, and long may be so.
Well, Ian Livingstone, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You can support the show in many ways. You can tell your friends. You could talk about it on social media. You can talk about it in your own blog, podcast or video, or you can support it directly by going to patreon.com/5G4D for a rolling donation, or for a one-off donation, hitting the PayPal link at the bottom of the website, 5gamesfordoomsday.com. It's these donations that keep the show going. Also, if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on Twitter at 5gamesfordoomsday, or send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. And if I've managed to flee from the radioactive Tories and the hands of God, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.